This happened to 4 teenagers in rural Arkansas in the year 2007. They didn't go into the forest looking for trouble. They went in because they were poor. Because sometimes desperation leads people into places they were never meant to enter. What they saw that night was not fast. It did not chase them. It did not scream. It stood still, 10 feet tall, between rows of pine trees, with eyes so bright they lit up the forest like headlights. And when fire fell from the sky and struck the ground at its feet, it didn't move. Tonight's story is about a forest that bends direction, a presence that watches instead of hunts, and something that follows you home without ever taking a single step. Listen carefully, because the most terrifying part of this story is not what they saw in the woods. It's what stayed with them long after they escaped. And by the time this story ends, you may never look at a quiet forest the same way again. In the year 2007, rural Arkansas was still a different place. The highways hadn't reached far enough. Cell phone signals faded quickly once you left town, and after sunset, darkness ruled everything. Caleb remembered that darkness well. Back then, he was 16 years old enough to understand fear, but too young to know when to listen to it. The area where he lived was surrounded by state-owned land, endless pine forests and timber plantations stretching for miles. Perfect rows of trees planted decades ago, all the same height, all the same age, like something artificial pretending to be nature. During the day, the forest looked harmless, quiet, orderly, almost comforting. But at night, the forest changed. The wind moved differently between the trunks. The air smelled thicker, heavier, and the darkness felt deep enough to drown in. Caleb wasn't alone in facing that darkness. There were 4 of them: Caleb, Mason, Noah, and Tyler. They grew up together, went to the same school, shared the same struggles. Their families were poor. Not the kind of poor people talk about casually, but the kind that decides what you eat, whether the lights stay on, and how early you grow up. That was how the forest entered their lives. At first, it was just an idea. Someone heard that pine resin could be sold. Scrap wood too. Not much money, but enough to help. They knew it was illegal. State land. No permission. No safety. That was why they only went at night. And that was why they never used flashlights. A beam of light in that forest could be seen for miles. And being caught meant trouble their families couldn't afford. So they learned to walk in darkness. They memorized the feel of the ground, the spacing between trees, the sound of their own breathing. Most nights, they stayed close to the forest's edge, close enough to hear distant roads, close enough to run if something went wrong. But even then, Caleb often felt like they were being watched, not seen, watched, as if something in the trees was aware of their presence, counting their steps, measuring their fear. He never said anything. Fear shared too often loses its power, and sometimes gains a different one. Then came the night everything changed. There was no full moon, only thin clouds drifting slowly across the sky. The forest was unusually silent. No insects, no birds, no distant animal calls. Mason noticed it first. "This place feels dead tonight." Tyler laughed it off, but his voice sounded forced. Noah said nothing at all. They crossed the usual boundary, the invisible line they rarely passed. That night, Mason wanted to go deeper. "There's more resin further in," he said. "Less people, less risk." Caleb felt his stomach tighten. Something about the suggestion felt wrong, like stepping off a familiar path into water you couldn't see the bottom of. But no one argued. They needed the money. So they entered the plantation. The trees stood in perfect parallel lines, stretching endlessly forward. Walking inside felt like moving through a tunnel built by something that understood order too well. They spread out, each choosing a line. And before moving on, they repeated their rule. "Stay in your lane. No crossing, no matter what." Because in a forest like that, losing direction was easy, and finding it again wasn't guaranteed. Caleb moved slowly, feeling the bark with his hands, scraping resin carefully. The darkness pressed close, wrapping around him like a living thing. Time became strange. Minutes felt long. Silence felt loud. Then, a sudden shout. Mason. Angry. Sharp. "What the hell are you doing?" Caleb froze. Noah stopped. Tyler stopped. Mason shouted again. "Stop blocking my line." Caleb's heart began to pound. No one had crossed. They knew that. They whispered back, urgently, telling Mason to calm down, to look again. For a moment, there was nothing. Then Mason spoke again, and this time, his voice was shaking. "There's someone here." Caleb felt the cold crawl up his spine. Mason said the figure was standing directly in front of him, about 20 to 25 feet away. Not moving, just standing there, watching. That was when Caleb realized something terrifying. In a forest this quiet, if someone else was there, they should have heard them. Footsteps, breathing, anything. But there was nothing, only silence, and the feeling that the forest itself was holding its breath. For a few seconds after Mason spoke, no one moved. Caleb stood frozen in his lane, one hand still pressed against the rough bark of a pine tree. The resin beneath his fingers felt sticky, warm, almost alive. "There's someone here," Mason repeated. This time, his voice barely carried through the forest. Caleb whispered back, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mason, no one crossed. You're alone in your line." The silence that followed felt wrong. Too heavy, too deliberate. Then Mason answered, "I know. That's why I'm scared." Caleb felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He strained his eyes forward, trying to see through the darkness separating the rows of trees. "Mason," Noah called softly, "what do you see?" There was a pause, long enough for fear to begin inventing shapes in the dark. Then Mason spoke again. "It's a person, just standing there. Right in front of me, 20 to 25 feet. That was the distance Mason described. Close enough to see a shape, but too far to make out details. Caleb swallowed. If someone really was standing there, They should have heard movement, a step, a shift, a breath. But the forest remained perfectly still. No wind, no rustling needles, no cracking branches. It was as if the trees themselves were afraid to move. "Could be a ranger," Tyler whispered. Just don't panic." That explanation settled into Caleb's mind like a thin blanket against the cold. A ranger made sense. Someone sitting in the dark, watching. They slowly began to regroup, stepping carefully out of their lanes. Every step felt loud. Every movement felt watched. As they came closer together, Caleb finally saw it. Between two rows of pine trees, something darker than the darkness itself. A silhouette, low to the ground, sitting, not slouched, not resting, sitting like it was waiting. Caleb felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "That's a man," Noah whispered. "Has to be." No uniform was visible, but in that darkness, colors meant nothing. The group instinctively began stepping backward. Slow, careful. No one wanted to turn their back. The silhouette didn't move. It didn't react. It didn't acknowledge them at all. That should have been comforting. Instead, it was terrifying. Then, the figure stood up and kept standing. Caleb's brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. At first, it looked normal. Then it rose higher than Mason, higher than Noah, higher than Tyler. It just kept unfolding, its shape stretching upward between the trees. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. "No," someone whispered. The figure stood nearly 10 feet tall. Its proportions were wrong. Too long, too straight. It didn't sway, didn't shift its weight. It simply stood there, as if gravity worked differently for it. Still, no sound. Caleb felt his legs weaken. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. But fear held him in place. Then the figure turned its head. Slowly, deliberately, and the forest exploded with light. Two eyes, brilliant white, blazing, like headlights cutting through fog, not reflecting moonlight, not glowing faintly. They burned. The light was so intense that Caleb instinctively raised his arm to shield his face. The trees around the figure were illuminated in sharp contrast, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. For a split second, Caleb thought the eyes were staring directly into him, not at his body, but at something deeper, something inside. Time seemed to stretch. His thoughts became fragments. Run, pray, hide. But none of those things happened. Then, from above, something moved. A sudden flash high in the pine canopy. Caleb barely had time to look up before it fell. A massive ball of fire, bright orange and white, dropping straight down from the treetops. It struck the ground directly beneath the creature. The impact shook the earth. Sparks exploded outward, scattering across the forest floor. Heat washed over the boys like a physical wave. Caleb smelled burning sap, burning wood, and something else. Something sharp and metallic. The creature didn't scream, didn't react. For one impossible moment, it stood perfectly still above the flames. And then fear finally released its grip. Run! Caleb didn't know who shouted. It didn't matter. They turned and ran. Branches whipped against their faces. Roots clawed at their feet. The forest blurred into streaks of darkness and shadow. Caleb's lungs burned. His legs screamed. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Behind them, there were no footsteps, no pursuit, no sound at all. That was the worst part. After what felt like forever, they finally collapsed. Hands on knees, gasping for air. Caleb dared to look back. Nothing. Just rows of trees fading into darkness. No eyes. No fire. Only silence. But deep down, Caleb knew something was wrong. They should have reached the edge by now. They should have seen the road. Instead, the forest felt endless. And then, they saw it. A dense bush. Thick. Wide. Unusual. They walked past it. Kept moving. And minutes later, they saw it again. The exact same bush. In the exact same place. Noah stopped. This isn't possible. The forest had been planted in straight lines. Nothing should repeat like that. Noah crouched down and placed 3 pieces of pine resin at the base of the bush. A marker, he whispered. They walked away, turned around, and the resin had moved. Not gone, moved, shifted slightly, as if something had touched it. Caleb felt dread crawl through his chest. They weren't lost. They were being led. And whatever had eyes like burning lights was still with them. They stood there for a long moment, for silhouettes trembling in the dark. The bush loomed in front of them, thick and misshapen, its leaves darker than the night around it. Caleb felt his mouth go dry. "This isn't right," Tyler whispered. The forest was planted in straight lines. That was something everyone in the county knew. Rows of trees, predictable paths. Nothing like this bush should exist, and nothing should appear twice. Noah crouched down again, his hands shaking as he examined the ground. "I put the resin right here," he said. "I know I did. 3 pieces. Triangular. Deliberate." Now they were no longer where they should have been. Not far away. Not scattered. Just moved. Shifted as if by careful fingers. Caleb felt the urge to look over his shoulder. He didn't. Some instincts exist for a reason. "Maybe we just turned around without realizing it," Mason said, though his voice lacked conviction. But Caleb knew the truth. They hadn't turned. They had been walking straight. Straight. Into something that didn't want them to leave. They chose a direction and moved again, faster now. Not running, but close. The darkness pressed in tighter. The air felt thicker with every step, heavy in their lungs, carrying the scent of sap and scorched earth from the fire they had fled. Minutes passed. Then, the bush appeared again. Caleb's heart sank. Same shape. Same broken branch on the left. Same patch of bare soil beneath it. Noah swore under his breath. "This forest is messing with us." Caleb felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. He tried to focus on his breathing, but every inhale felt shallow, strained. "Stop," Caleb said suddenly. The others froze. "If we keep walking like this," he continued, "we're going to run ourselves into the ground." They stood together, backs nearly touching, turning slowly in a circle. Rows of pine trees extended endlessly in every direction. Perfect. Identical. No landmarks. No sound. No sky visible through the canopy. Just blackness and order. That was when Caleb realized something else. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. Not crowded. Not loud. Just aware. As if something was standing just beyond sight, moving when they weren't looking. Adjusting the paths. Tilting the world slightly every time they took a step. Tyler whispered, "Do you think it's still here?" No one answered. They didn't need to. Caleb felt it in his bones. The creature with the burning eyes didn't need to chase them. It already had them. They tried another direction. Same result. The bush. Again. Each time they returned to it, Caleb felt weaker. Like the forest was draining something from him. Confidence. Hope. Time. Finally, Noah sank to his knees. "This isn't an accident," he said, his voice breaking. "We're being led." The word hung in the air. Led. Caleb's thoughts raced. Stories he'd heard growing up. Local warnings. Whispers from older folks who refused to walk the woods at night. About lights that weren't lights. Paths that moved. Things that watched. Caleb felt his throat tighten. "We shouldn't be here," he said quietly. No one argued. Mason rubbed his face with shaking hands. "We only came because we needed the money." His voice cracked. That was when Caleb felt something shift inside him. An idea. A desperate one. "We should pray," he said. The others looked at him. Not with skepticism. With relief. Because when logic fails, people reach for something older. Something deeper. They gathered close, forming a tight circle. Caleb closed his eyes. The darkness felt closer with them shut, as if something leaned in. His voice trembled as he spoke. "God, please. We didn't mean to do wrong. We were just trying to help our families." Noah joined in, his words tumbling over each other. "We're sorry for coming here. We didn't know. Please let us go." Tyler's prayer was barely a whisper. Mason sobbed openly. The forest remained silent. For a terrifying moment, nothing changed. Then, a sound. Faint. Distant. A low hum. Caleb opened his eyes. Between the trees, far off, there was a glow. White. Steady. Not burning. Not moving. Headlights. Caleb's heart leapt. "There!" he gasped. They broke into a run. This time, the forest didn't twist. The bush didn't appear. The rows stayed straight. As they ran toward the light, Caleb felt the weight lift from his chest, like hands releasing their grip. The headlights grew brighter. A pickup truck. Idling. A forest ranger. The boys burst into the open space, stumbling and nearly collapsing at the edge of the road. The ranger jumped out, startled. "Where did you come from?" he demanded. Caleb couldn't answer. He was shaking too hard. Mason dropped to his knees. Noah laughed and cried at the same time. Tyler stared back into the forest. The ranger followed his gaze. "What happened out there?" he asked. They told him. About the figure, the height, the eyes, the fire, the circles. the bush. As they spoke, the ranger's expression changed. His jaw tightened. His grip on the flashlight grew firm. He didn't laugh. He didn't question them. He simply said, "You're not supposed to be in there at night." He drove them home without another word. But as the truck pulled away, Caleb looked back. Deep in the forest, between the rows of trees, he thought he saw something tall, standing perfectly still, watching. The ride back felt longer than it should have. The pickup truck moved slowly along the narrow road, its headlights cutting a thin tunnel through the darkness. Inside the cab, no one spoke. Caleb sat rigid in his seat, hands clenched in his lap, his body still trembling as the adrenaline slowly drained away. Every time the truck hit a bump, he flinched, half expecting to feel something grab him from behind. Mason stared out the window, his face pale, eyes unfocused. Noah leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, whispering fragments of prayers under his breath. Tyler kept turning around, looking back through the rear window, as if something might be following. The forest ranger drove in silence. That silence was worse than questions. When Caleb finally dared to glance at him, he noticed the way the ranger's jaw was clenched, the way his knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. This wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. When they reached the edge of town, the ranger pulled over. "You boys listen to me," he said quietly. His voice was calm, too calm. "You stay out of that forest. At night. During the day. Doesn't matter. No lecture. No threats. Just a warning." Then he drove away. That night, none of them slept. Caleb lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the image over and over again. The height, the eyes, and the way the creature hadn't moved when the fire fell. As if it belonged there. As if the forest itself had called it. The next morning, everything looked normal. Sunlight streamed through the trees. Birds sang. The world continued. That was somehow unsettling. Caleb expected the forest to look burned, scarred, marked by what had happened. But there was nothing. No blackened ground. No broken trees. It was as if the night had never existed. They didn't talk about it at school. They didn't talk about it at home. Some things feel too dangerous to name. Weeks passed, then months. They avoided the forest at night completely. But hunger and habit are persistent things. Eventually, they returned. Only during the day. Only near the edge. Only where the road was visible. Even then, Caleb felt watched. Every snap of a branch made his heart jump. Every shift of light between the trees felt intentional. The forest had lost its innocence. Then came the day Mason collapsed. It was early afternoon. Sun high. Clear sky. Mason had gone alone to gather scrap wood near the tree-line. He said he wouldn't go far. He didn't. They found him less than 50 yards in, lying on the ground, unconscious. Caleb remembered the way Mason's body looked wrong against the forest floor, like something that had been placed there rather than fallen. They shook him, called his name. Nothing. When Mason finally came to, he screamed. Not a startled shout. A scream of pure terror. Caleb grabbed his shoulders, trying to calm him. "Mason, it's us. You're okay." Mason's eyes were wide, wild. She was there, he whispered. Caleb felt a chill crawl up his spine. Who? Noah asked. Mason swallowed hard. The woman. They brought him back to the edge of the forest, sat him down, gave him water. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the bottle. Caleb asked him again, "What did you see?" Mason hesitated, then spoke. "I was picking up wood," he said slowly. "I felt like someone was watching me." Caleb's chest tightened. "I looked up," Mason continued, his voice barely audible, "and she was sitting in the tree." "What tree?" Tyler asked. Mason shook his head. "I don't know. A pine. She was high up, too high." His breathing grew shallow. She was wearing white, like a dress. Her hair was long, hanging down. Caleb felt sick. What was she doing? Noah asked. Mason's eyes filled with tears. She was smiling. A long silence followed. Mason said she didn't move, didn't speak. She just looked down at him and smiled. Then the world went black. After that day, Mason refused to go near the forest at all. He wouldn't even walk past it. He said sometimes, when the wind blew through the trees, he could hear something whispering his name. Caleb believed him, because sometimes, late at night, Caleb would wake suddenly, heart racing, certain, absolutely certain, that something tall was standing just outside his window, watching, not moving, waiting. The forest still stood where it always had, but for them, it was no longer just trees. It was a place that remembered, and it hadn't finished with them yet. After Mason collapsed, nothing was ever the same again. They didn't make a decision that day. There was no agreement spoken out loud. They simply stopped going into the forest. At first, it was temporary, just until Mason recovered, just until things felt normal again. But normal never returned. Caleb noticed the change in small ways. Mason stopped sleeping through the night. Noah avoided any path that ran alongside trees. Tyler started carrying a pocket Bible everywhere he went, even though he'd never been religious before. And Caleb felt like something had followed him home. Not physically, not in a way he could point to, but in the way silence felt heavier than it used to. In the way shadows lingered a second too long. In the way his thoughts kept circling back to the same image. A figure too tall to be human. Eyes that didn't reflect light, but produced it. He tried to tell himself it had been fear, stress, exhaustion, but fear didn't explain everything. Word started spreading through town. Not from them. They never talked about it. But small towns have their own way of remembering. An old man at the gas station mentioned how people used to get lost in those woods. A woman at church said her cousin once followed lights at night and didn't remember how he got home. Someone else whispered about watchers in the pines. Caleb listened, and every story felt uncomfortably familiar. One evening, he asked his father about the forest. They were sitting on the porch, the sun dipping low behind the trees. His father went quiet. "That place," he finally said. "People have always said things about it." "What kind of things?" Caleb asked. His father exhaled slowly. "People feeling watched. paths changing, seeing things that shouldn't be there. Caleb's heart pounded. Why didn't anyone warn us? His father looked at him carefully. Because most folks don't listen until they have a reason to. That night, Caleb dreamed of the forest. But it wasn't dark. It was bright. Too bright. The pine trees stretched endlessly upward, their tops disappearing into white light. And between them, something moved. Tall, silent, watching. He woke up gasping. As the weeks passed, Caleb noticed something else. Every time he drove past the edge of the plantation, he felt pressure in his chest. Not fear, recognition, as if the forest knew him, as if it remembered. Mason's condition worsened. He refused to talk about the woman in white anymore. But sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, he would stop speaking, tilt his head slightly, and whisper, "Did you hear that?" There was never anything to hear. Noah admitted something one night. He said that after the incident, he sometimes felt disoriented, even in familiar places. Like the world could turn him around without warning. Like directions could lie. Tyler became obsessed with maps. Old maps. New maps. He said he needed to know where he was at all times. That forest messes with space, he said once. Not just people. Caleb understood. He began researching local history. Old newspapers. County records. The plantation had been replanted multiple times over the decades. Before the pines, there had been something else. Older growth, paths long forgotten, and before that, nothing was written, which somehow felt intentional. Locals avoided the area after sunset. Not openly, not dramatically. They just didn't go there, like an unspoken agreement. Caleb eventually spoke to a former forest worker. The man hesitated before answering. "You boys saw the lights, didn't you?" Caleb's blood ran cold. The man nodded slowly. "People always think it's one thing. A spirit, a creature, an angel. A demon." He looked toward the trees. "But I think it's the place itself." Caleb didn't ask him to explain. He didn't want to hear the answer. Years later, the state began logging the area. Trees came down. Machines moved in. The landscape changed. And slowly, the stories stopped. People said the forest had been cleansed. But Caleb wasn't so sure. Because some nights, when the wind blows just right, he still feels it. That sensation of being watched. Not threatened. Not chased. Simply observed. Patiently. As if something tall, something ancient, is waiting for the forest to grow back. Time has a way of burying things. Years passed. Caleb grew older. So did Mason, Noah, and Tyler. Life moved on in the way it always does, quietly, without asking whether you're ready or not. The pine plantation didn't survive. The state approved logging. Machines moved in. Rows of trees that had stood for decades were cut down and hauled away. The forest changed shape. Paths vanished. Clearings appeared where darkness once lived. Eventually, the land was replanned. New boundaries, new purposes. And with those changes, the stories began to fade. People stopped talking about being followed, stopped whispering about strange lights, stopped avoiding the place after sunset. To most, it became just another piece of land. But Caleb knew better, because even though the trees were gone, the memory of them wasn't. He never went back after the logging began, not because he was afraid of what he might see, but because he was afraid of what he might recognize. Caleb tried to live a normal life. He worked. He built a family. He learned how to carry responsibilities. But the forest followed him in quieter ways. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still feel the texture of pine bark beneath his fingers. Sometimes, when headlights cut through thick fog, his chest tightened, his breath catching before he even understood why. The image came without warning. A silhouette between the trees. Too tall, too still, eyes blazing white in the darkness. Not moving, not chasing, just watching. Mason never fully recovered. Even years later, he avoided wooded areas whenever possible. He refused to camp, refused to hike, and he never forgot the woman in white. He said once, quietly, "I don't think she was meant for me. I think I just looked up when I wasn't supposed to." Noah moved away from Arkansas. He said the land felt wrong to him, like certain places could remember your name and call it when you weren't listening. Tyler stayed. He said someone had to, but he never went near the old plantation site. He said whatever lived there didn't need trees to exist, only memory. Caleb heard one last story years later. A construction worker on the redeveloped land claimed he saw a tall figure standing at the edge of the site just before dawn. No eyes, no fire, just height. When he blinked, it was gone. The report was dismissed. Always was. Because things like that don't fit neatly into paperwork. Caleb doesn't talk about the forest often, but sometimes, late at night, when the world grows quiet, he remembers the silence, the order, the way the forest seemed to close around them. He remembers the moment when fear stopped feeling wild and started feeling intentional, as if something had made a decision. And when people ask him what scared him most, it isn't the fire, it isn't the woman in white, it isn't even getting lost. It's this: the creature never chased them. It never needed to. It stood there, 10 feet tall, with eyes like headlights, and watched them leave, as if it knew they would carry it with them forever.